All right. Well, hope y'all are having a good Monday. We're going to go ahead and get started with me sharing the screen. The whole world gets to hear me. Excuse me a second while I close my door. Sorry, you guys. All right. Well, let's go ahead. And Tina, are you on with us today? Can you take anything special you need in terms of roll call, any announcements you want to make while I'm getting myself together here?
I'm on. I just sent a message in the chat that if you are only signed on by a telephone number, to either send me a chat or an email so I know that you are on the call. Otherwise, I can see your name and I can tell that you are in the call.
Wonderful. Well, I just thank you all for being here. This is our fourth week, which is crazy. Part of me is looking forward to being done next week, and the other part of me is thinking we don't have enough time and we need more meetings. So we'll revisit that at the end. Today is kind of a strange set of revisiting a little bit on the indicators and some of the combinations and special topics. Let me go ahead and get started. So we're going to look at a little bit of minimum N information, kind of seeking your thoughts, your vetting on this. It's a different way of looking at it that I'm going to share with you. Also, I'm going to go in and mute. Hang on just a minute. Manage my participants here. Mute all. And then, can you all still hear me? Okay, if you need to unmute, then feel free to unmute to ask a question, but just to control background noise, I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody. All right, and then I'm going to get rid of the screen in me. So going back really quickly, we're going to do minimum N. We're going to look at participation rates. We're going to get your input on some mobility, partial attendance, including all public schools in Arkansas, and we're going to start on the exit criteria. We will not finish that. There's still some clarity that we're still seeking for some of this. And then if we can make enough progress today, then the last week we'll talk a little bit about data procedures. There's just one or two small things, some report card design questions, and then recap and revisit things that we have to come back to. Again, I won't read these, but the norms and expectations, we're really striving for possibility and ideas. And I know, so today I'm trying something a little bit differently. I know some of you do not want to be contributing on the recording, but we really need you to help structure a follow-up survey. I tried to work on a follow-up survey and for these next areas, and I found that aside from just having total open input, I need your input from this Zoom to create that survey so I can have some good selections so that it is a quick survey for you to go through. And again, just reorienting to, we're trying to reflect on and refine our theory of action for an accountability system and how this advances all students being prepared for success in college careers and community engagement. How does this help us achieve a vision for excellence in the state of Arkansas? And also, it really is an opportunity to reimagine how we support students to advance equity, access, and opportunity. This is very much about support. And my last bullet here is a bullet I've added because it seems that I was reading recently about innovation in another country, in New Zealand to be precise. And in New Zealand, in visits that were made there by a person I'm a fan of, Susan Patrick from INACOL, she visited for a month under an Eisenhower Fellowship, and they discussed the difference in how New Zealand uses accountability versus the US under AYP and No Child Left Behind. And it drew me, their wording drew me to opportunity. They talk about two functions of an accountability system. One is an evaluative function. It's that responsibility we have. It's kind of a fiduciary responsibility. We have to report on what we've done with the public trust of money. That's one function. We also want to enhance the developmental function of accountability. We want the system to signal to schools and districts where kids are struggling and where systems are struggling to support those kids, to provide them with access, equity, and opportunity. And we want that developmental function to lead towards an improvement toward excellence. So how do we balance these two competing tensions? That's, again, part of what we're thinking about. So the final survey results I sent to everybody earlier, and if you're like me and you haven't had a chance to read your email, it'll probably be sitting in your inbox if you're on, I have over 30 people now on the Zoom notification list. So I've sent you that information, and I'm wondering, from those of you who've had a chance to take a look at it, questions or comments on what you saw in the final survey results. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Well, again, knowing that our time is so limited, I'm trying to practice good wait time while balancing it against knowing exactly what we have to get through today. So just know the top options. What I did was I summarized the top 3 out of what you all indicated, and those have been provided to a partner that's helping us to generate informational materials that can help us communicate that to a broader audience. And then my hope is that we will be able to continue the meaningful consultation by adding some more data-informed examples into that information. And I don't know if we'll still be surveying. I'm hoping we will, or in some way interacting to get additional feedback from you all now that we've kind of narrowed the scope of what we're looking at. So if you think about it, if you come back to this and you have questions, please don't hesitate to email me questions or comments that can inform that process. So given that, let's move on to more minimum end data. We've got different views, and I'd love to discuss this based on the different views. Lewis pointed out to me very importantly that we have some competing interests. Minimum N is not a concept that we can decide on independently. It's interdependent, and there are competing interests. So one of the competing interests is validity and reliability of group statistics, and another is advancing equity. So depending on what you do for indicators and how you combine them, the validity and reliability of the minimum N might look a little bit different. So let me give you some examples. One of the reasons that 25 was initially chosen for Arkansas back in the day, I'm talking back in 2003, the very first AYP plan, was because we were all being held accountable on a statistic that is very volatile with minimum N. So when you're looking at a percentage of students that met or exceeded a target out of a total number of students, when you get down to 10, a minimum N of 10, you have a greater impact of a single student than if you have a minimum N of 20 or 25. So the validity and reliability of that statistic, particularly the reliability, that was a huge concern, and that's why it was set at 25, which was considered at the time. Now, literature has grown and changed since then, but at the time, 25 was considered kind of the minimum for a statistically stable group. And Sarah, if you have any information you want to add, or others who've studied this, feel free. When it comes to something like the value-added growth score, we don't find smaller N's to be as impactful. So, and also when you look at weighted performance, there really isn't a minimum N there. Every student counts. So we can't make a decision about minimum N and talk about validity and reliability without really knowing how we're going to measure and report on those indicators and how they're going to come together in a rating system. All of that to say that since it seemed like from the results, people are leaning towards an index combined with either a dashboard of measures, multiple measures, or a dashboard of matrices, given that that seems to be the preference, then that is something we have to keep in mind as we talk about minimum N, because all students count within an index. And then if we were reporting on a multiple measures, or if we were using a matrix, we might need to think differently about how that minimum N might apply. So keeping that in mind, it also depends on the number of years that are included in the calculations. And we're starting to see states doing some interesting things with more years. So for example, under the old AYP, because there were schools who didn't have 25 students in their tested non-mobile population in a single year, I'm trying to think of the one school that this always happened to, we literally had to have a special rule for small schools. And in that special rule for extremely small schools, we used 3 years of data. That's also why under the old AYP and under the old ESSA flexibility, when we were dealing with targets, we used a choice of, or we used either the 3-year composite or the most recent year of information, because we were dealing with percent meeting or exceeding. And that is a more volatile statistic depending on group size. So there are a lot of different ways for us to deal with the considerations for statistical validity and reliability in terms of minimum N, depending on how this accountability system eventually plays out. The other issue we're always thinking about, you may not be, but I have worked in schools that were high-income schools where I'm embarrassed to say sometimes I would pray that some kids would actually be ill because they were never absent. And then I've been in schools that were very challenged and had at-risk populations where I used to pray that we could get those kids to school in the morning. And it really does differ depending on the students that you serve. When you have a more transient or highly mobile rate at your school, this tends to impact your minimum N for your subgroups especially. In other words, for accountability purposes, if you're only looking at the students who've been there for a full academic year, you're going to have a smaller number of students. So luckily, we've been doing most of our modeling using what would actually be used in accountability. Also, there's a big change coming under ESSA accountability. ESSA requires that we report all students, including the highly mobile students. So even though for accountability purposes, we can exclude our highly mobile students in how we do our indicators and how we come up with that annual meaningful differentiation and determination of schools, we must report on all students, including highly mobile. So that means that our reporting data will look different than our data that are used for accountability because it will exclude those highly mobile students. And let me take you, well, before I go in here, thoughts, reflection, reaction to what I've put up in front of you here. I'll unmute you all, and anybody have anything they want to add to this discussion?
And then holding out for accountability.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're having a discussion, go ahead and share it with us if you feel like you can. Unmute yourself and share it. Okay, no takers on that one. All right. What percentage of schools? So this is data that was presented early on to the ESSA steering committee. And I'm sharing an addition to it. What this data basically did was it showed us the percentage of schools in the column all the way on the right, given our current minimum N of 25 students, you can see the percentage of schools that were included in the accountability system for each of these groups. At the high end, we have all students and free and reduced lunch students, which is why we use the tag under ESSA flexibility. We were trying to capture more groups. And we knew that schools did not have a tolerance for shifting from 40 lower than 25. But look at our EL population, only approximately 29%, and our special ed, 53.5, are being captured. In the yellow cells, you can see the other race groups. A question was raised very recently about whether or not the state should be including these other race groups in the calculations. And back in 2003, 2004, these populations were so low in the state and they were so dispersed. And even where these students were clustered, the populations were so small that they were not included in the accountability. Now, the question whether or not they need to be included is something that we probably need to discuss. Their dispersion and their clustering is still pretty low compared to the other populations that we do include. And then in the middle, you see gifted, because that was something that people have raised as a potential subgroup. So you notice that in order to get just to 50% of schools that have EL students, having an accountable subgroup, you would have to get down to an N of 10. So this is one way to think about it. This is a school-focused perspective. Let me take, and you can see as you go to a smaller and smaller minimum N, more and more schools fall in those accountability ranges. This is just a graphic way to look at this. I put the 20% dashed line in there because I wanted to show that most of these groups that people have asked whether they need to be added, they really still are not at a significant statistical level for them to be included. If they were included, most of them would be redacted. So then let's look at a student-focused way. And Lewis, I credit you for finding Ohio's minimum N work, and we discovered they had done a lot of the things that we were doing, and they did a few extras. And this is one that I thought was really helpful, because to me, this is a student-focused perspective. When we think about the percentage of students in each subgroup statewide that would be included in the accountability system, based on the various minimum N size determinations, what would we see? And let's see, I don't know, nope, hang on, let me take you back. So notice in the very right-hand side, I've highlighted in red that we're not even covering 80% of our special ed students with a minimum N of 25. So that means 20% of our special ed students in the state are not in a school where there's an accountable group for them. And then you can see it really speaks to how kids are clustered and how they're dispersed when you look at the data from a student-focused perspective. As you move to the left from the right, we get to 90% at an N of 15. And then we get to 95% of students being included at an N of 10. And I think for me, this was a really different view. And it speaks to whether or not we are really concerned about that equity and making sure that students across the state have access and opportunity. So here, again, is the percentage of students. The groups that we haven't been including are including in the past. The race groups that we haven't been including are the lines that you see lowest. And then at the very top are where you see the groups that have always been included, but special ed, Hispanic, African American, and English learners, we would need to get to a minimum N of 10 to 15 in order to have 90 to 95% of students in the accountability system for the purposes of support. And I will tell you that this conversation is so different when you talk to accountability folks versus talking to like the English language learner group. They're very much focused on the support function of this. So we have student and school perspectives that we're trying to balance, and they can seem to be competing tensions. If the state system of accountability is focused on development, building the capacity of districts to improve struggling schools, then I think you can find a place where these two forces kind of balance each other out. The question is that balance point at the current status quo at 78% of students in the system, or is it at 86% or at 90% or at 95%? I would love, I'm going to unmute you all because I need to hear your reaction to it. And consider this a discussion where it's not, you're not just talking to me. We're going to talk amongst ourselves, as they say, in New York and Saturday Night Live.
This is Dave Blunt, and couple questions. First off,
Hey, can you increase your volume? I can barely hear you. I don't know if others are hearing you more clearly. Ooh, yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay, you got it? Okay. So my question is whether, according to law, the N has to be the same on every subject.
I'm going to mute everybody else and unmute you because we really, there's a lot of interference in the background. Hang on just a minute. I'm just so thrilled somebody's willing to speak up. So, okay. Let me mute all. Sorry. And then me unmute you. Go ahead.
Is that better?
Yes, that's a little better.
Okay. So according to the law, does the N have to be the same for every subgroup in a given state? Or could there be variance in the N by subgroup?
That is correct, Jay. Where we are hearing some latitude is in the indicator for English language progress, English language acquisition progress. When it comes to the indicators where we disaggregate by subgroup, minimum N must be the same for all of those subgroups. For the indicator that would be included for English language progress, we are, it doesn't appear that there is anything to prevent that, and it's our understanding that there are states considering requesting to be able to have a different minimum N for English language learner progress versus, and that is on English language acquisition, right? Not on content tests. But then when it comes to indicators of graduation rate, achievement, growth, and the fifth indicator, we would have to disaggregate using the same minimum N for all subgroups. Good question.
Well, that then, you know, I mean, my sentiment is for getting as many students into the accountability system as possible by subgroup. And while in some cases, you know, a smaller N might not be as essential, then I do think that in this balancing act that there's tremendous importance in terms of inclusion of as many students as possible and getting as many data points as possible. I recognize the privacy issues, but I do feel that, you know, an N that's closer to 10 is better for those reasons.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Other thoughts out there, and if you're, feel free to interrupt me, but I'm going to throw this out there. I used to feel like the thought out there was the higher the minimum N, the more equitable it was for large schools. And I say that because of comments over the years regarding my school is accountable for 7 subgroups of each subject and your school is only accountable for 2. When in fact, raising the minimum N doesn't increase that equity. Actually lowering the minimum N increases the equity between large schools and small schools. And that was something that I had to look at the data to really see. Thoughts about that?
And this is Sarah McKenzie, and looking at the data, the difference between the minimum N of 10 and 15 at the school level, it doesn't make a huge difference in the number of schools, except for ELL and Hispanic, there is some difference. But until you get to 20, things don't change a lot. So I'm with Jay on, especially if we're going to use a more stable measure, like a weighted performance score or including the VAM. I think 10 is where I would put my chips.
I'm just thrilled you guys are participating. Others?
Denise, as a school who was impacted in almost every area with those numbers previously, I still think if we're really looking in our state, if we are having an impact and we're looking at having an impact with the majority of our students, then I too could support the N of 10, because we're supposed to be seeing if we're making an impact for all students. And I think that if that's where 95% of our students will be represented, that is certainly the way we need to go. I think it's just ethical that we would represent the majority of our students.
Great. All right. It's a great discussion. Others, reflections.
Denise, this is Danielle, and I would say the 10 we would go with that as well. The only thing is, I think that it's good that the state is attempting to look at support versus punishment. Yes. Because we are hit for every area, every time, and if the process is looked at through different lenses, that we're aiming for support, the state is reaching out to support and not punish, then I think that that's helpful, and TUI would be for that 10.
Gotcha. And the thing to remember too is, we're all dealing with a limited amount of resources. And if we're not identified for support, we may not have the same level of access to those resources. And in the end, that the level of need and the level of density of need are all factors that should come into play. But right now we have schools out there, and it's been interesting listening in on the English Learner advisory team, because there are schools out there that basically have English learners, and they don't get any support. Not that they don't get any support, but they don't get Title III money because their cluster of kids is not significant enough at a district level. And yet those needs, if you've ever taught in a classroom, which I have with multiple English learners, those needs are there. We can't ignore them. So this is helpful. Any last thoughts before I switch to the next piece? Right, I'm gonna mute all, if I can find my mouse, mute all again, and take us on to the next level. All right, the next one, not next level, next topic, excuse me. There are really two parts to participation rates, and part of me is anxious to share. The other part of me is, this just raises so many of the data procedure questions that come up over the years that have been dealt with really reside in these issues. So let's take a look at the first participation rate issue, or topic, all assessments, ensuring that at least 95% of students are assessed annually in the required assessments. And then after that, we'll look at alternate assessments and the 1% participation rule, because that has changed pretty significantly under ESSA. 95% tested is not a new requirement. It's the same requirement. What's different is the latitude we have in figuring this out and how to incorporate it. So we have to annually measure the achievement of not less than 95% of all students, and 95% of all students in each subgroup of students who are enrolled in our schools, our public schools, on the assessments. And these two pieces in red are actually part of the statute. It can be a little confusing. It says, for the purpose of measuring, calculating, and reporting on the indicator that's described in subparagraph BI, you can include in the denominator the greater of either 95% of all such students or 95% of all such students in the subgroup, as the case may be. This is something that I'm familiar with because I know other states are doing this. BI is the achievement indicator. And what some states have done, rather than use a decision rule like we used to have under AYP, it used to be that if you missed 95% assessed on your all students for 2 years in a row, then you could move into alert and then into school improvement, et cetera, et cetera. And the other way that 95% was really closely watched was you couldn't qualify for safe harbor unless you had met 95% for all subgroups. Under ESSA flexibility, those requirements were eased pretty tremendously. You had to meet 95% tested for all students in TAG, and then if you didn't meet 95% for your subgroups, you had to have a plan in place to talk about it in your plan if you were doing your exit plan. So what this does is it takes, for example, if you were to use percent of kids ready or exceeding, then you would include in your denominator the non-tested students. Right now, those kids are excluded, but in some states, they include the non-tested students in the denominator so that your percent ready and exceeding for that achievement indicator is depressed by the rate or the number of students for which you did not test that were enrolled. That is what some states do. I actually talked to a state accountability director who had started by having a rule that they had an A through F system in their federal accountability for their state. And what they basically said was, you're going to lose a grade level if you don't test 95% of your students. And then they got so many complaints from that they switched to this method. And she said that this was actually more desirable by this, or more desired by the schools, because it looks impactful, but it's not as impactful as you think. The schools, the percentage of schools in our state that aren't testing 95% is not as big as you might fear. So these are what the statute gives us. The state is required to give a clear and understandable explanation of how we will factor the requirement of the clause of this subparagraph, you gotta love the legal system, into the statewide accountability system. And the regulations, which were repealed, we don't have to do what's on here, but what was suggested to us in meetings on Thursday and Friday were, you can look back at those regulations for ideas, but don't let them limit your thinking. So here, what they had said was, they gave you some ideas. Receive a lower summative determination. That's like losing a grade, or moving down in the system of schools. You could receive the lowest performance level on the academic achievement indicator. You could be identified for targeted supports and improvement, or you could be subject to some other state set of actions that is sufficiently rigorous. I put this out here for your reaction and for ideas. As I said, this is one of those where I can put the statute language and I can put these options, into the survey. But if you have other ideas that you would like to see included, there always in the survey will be a place to think and add later. But I'm really curious if y'all have any ideas, or just your reaction to, for example, this idea of adding those students in at the lowest performance level, for example, as a way to handle 95% tested. Go ahead and unmute yourself if you will. That seems to be the best way to work. All right.
Denise, what are the main reasons that people give for not testing their 95%?
That is an excellent question that I do not know the answer to, Sarah.
Because it seems like you'd want to know the problem before you tried to address it, right?
Yeah.
And if it's about mobility or poor organizational systems in the district or something like that, those require different approaches.
So, and interesting you say that, because it is such a small number of district or schools in the state. I think it's under 60, which is very small percent. And it would be interesting to find out. I know, this is impacted by the enrollment files that get pulled and then matched to the testing. And Lewis, your group there, you might testify to the percentage of schools that don't go in and correct the data, because we do see, schools have an opportunity to make that right, to make it reflect reality, but there's a good percentage that never go in the system during the corrections period to deal with that. So that you raise a really good point. That might be a good thing to add to the questioning.
Because it seems like it will be biased against smaller districts that don't have the technical expertise. And if the enrollment data is not right in the first place, but then they don't know how to go in and correct it, that just counting those kids as not proficient maybe isn't the right approach.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's as you all know, you all might be able to testify to this as well. We're always trying to figure out how we can have such differences between what is pulled from eSchool and what shows up from the testing file, given all the changes and improvements that have been made in recent years. Sarah, you make an excellent point there, and that bias towards small schools.
This is, pick up on that, this is Jay. I think on Sarah's question, I mean, my gut is that around the country, there are two phenomena at work. One is the transience issue, and then the other is the parental opt-out, which is, I think, particularly aggressive in certain higher income areas where there's a backlash to testing. And I could see that the penalty, lowering by a grade, I can't remember the exact language, of some kind of penalty would work particularly well with the kind of higher income opt-out issue that ends up being an extra penalty to already troubled districts if it's about transients.
Right.
And so my gut is that in Arkansas, we have not seen big opt-out movement, but we've seen
Correct.
transients issue. And so I do worry that we're penalizing already troubled districts. And so, I would kind of lean towards some kind of, flagging approach that certainly highlights the issue and raises those concerns, but doesn't have that same penalty impact. And I see that people are still having trouble hearing me, and I apologize.
No, it is. It's hard. So these are really good points that you guys are making, and I will get incorporated into that. Others, before we move on, this is terrific.
This is Carlene at Jonesboro. I wasn't able to hear everything that Jay was saying, but it seemed like he was talking about opt-out, and I think that we don't want to give people the chance to opt out. We're testing all kids. We want to be sure we do that. But it's also important that schools do test at least 95%, because if they aren't and they're not held accountable to that, then that's just going to mess up their data. Then when you start comparing it to other schools and we start ranking schools and looking at that, then we're not really comparing the same thing. So it's really important that we do come up with something. I don't know if I have an idea about what to come up with, but that we do come up to hold people accountable for the 95%.
So this is a terrific discussion, you guys. I so appreciate it. If you're not familiar with the National Council for Measurement and Education, they came out with a formal statement about opt-out and state suggestions for state policy. And Carlene, exactly for that reason, because if we're not all testing at least 95%, then we don't have comparable data. And they had a series of suggestions for that, but they point out in particular the importance of testing 95% for equity, because if we don't know what's going on with all of our students, how can we ensure that they're getting equitable access to opportunity? So these are terrific points, and I would just ask if you still need to mull this over and think about it. I am working on a survey. I don't have it ready for today because I can barely keep up, but I will include these points in it, and then also have a place where if you do come up with additional ideas in your own conversations, where you can, of course, add in additional ideas. So this is really terrific. Right now, opt-out is not a big issue in our state. Very, very tiny percent. There's a place where it can be noted in the reasons not tested. It's kind of in the student refused to test, but it can be noted. And what we've noted is it's just not an enormous issue in Arkansas, because we have a state law that says we've got to test all of our students. So I haven't been keeping track of the chat. So if there are things in the chat that we need to talk about, then Tina or somebody feel free to interrupt me. What I'd like to do is move on to 1% cap, because we will run out of time and there's way more on here, as usual, just because there's so much. The 1% cap is you want to talk about a strange thing. So the ESSA requires that a state, ESSA says that a state may provide alternate assessments that are aligned with either the challenging state academic standards and alternate academic achievement standards for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. But then they have this big qualifier here: if it's a dependency, if the state ensures, consistent with a clause I'm going to show you next, ensures that for each subject, the total number of students assessed in such subject using the alternate assessments does not exceed 1% of the total number of all students in the state who are assessed in such subject. You may be familiar with what we used to call the 1% cap. Well, here's where it's different. This is that clause they referenced. Under the clause, it's subject to, so this first paragraph is basically kids shouldn't be taking an alternate assessment unless it's part of their IEP, and it should be part of a big process that's determined at the school level. But look at the prohibition line at the bottom. There's a prohibition. Nothing in the paragraph shall be construed to permit the Secretary of U.S. Department of Ed or a state educational agency to impose on any local agency a cap on the percentage of students administered an alternate assessment, except that the LEA exceeding the cap applied to the state under clause shall submit information justifying the need to exceed such cap. Now, each year we have, let me give you some data. The current reality is that we have about 3,300 non-mobile students tested on the MSAA in math and that receive a valid scale score, about 3,700 in ELA. So our total alternately assessed last year was 7,075. Last year, the focus was on not exceeding the cap with proficient scores. And at that point, we had to focus on how many proficient scores were there. And it's about 20, I want to say it's 29 to 2,400 in each subject area. But we had to literally change 711 scores that were considered level 3, level 4 proficient to non-proficient for the purposes of accountability under the old law. Under the new law, we won't be doing that. You won't have to say who you want to exclude or who you don't want to exclude. Here's the deal, though. The focus goes from 1% of proficient scores to 1% participation. So our total regularly assessed is about 500,000. 1% of that is 5,323. If you take the number of students over the 1%, then we're assessing 1,752 students more than we're supposed to as a state. So this is going to be an interesting thing because the state will no longer be able to say, hey, you can't do that. But the state will have to follow up with every district that goes over and say, what is your plan for addressing this? I know that the special education unit is working on this. We've talked about this because for accountability purposes under ESSA, it's not as big of an issue. But if you talk to the special education unit, when it comes to IDEA and a few other things that I don't know enough about, but Jody Fields knows everything about, there are repercussions or consequences within those laws. So this is one that any thoughts moving forward, or let's leave this to play out with the special education unit and go from there.
This is Cheryl Gall, and I just wanted to say, as a special ed teacher, we probably really are testing 1,700 kids that we may or may not need to. And by that I mean, sometimes when the regs define the most significant cognitive impairments, they're not necessarily looking at some of the students that we have. Students on tracheostomy, severe, medically fragile, health involved students that aren't generating any type of data that's useful other than to make it compliance for a teacher. It's driven by what a teacher can do to interpret the law. So how I used to explain it was, if the trunk of the tree is your gen ed population, the furthest tip of the furthest branch are some of our kids. And while I am a very strong advocate for testing our kids that we can get data from and make it be useful, I don't know that we're necessarily doing ourselves any benefit from testing some of our truly most significantly cognitively impaired kiddos.
And you make a great point, Cheryl. And I know this is where the special education unit, where their expertise is so valuable, because they know and understand the things that you're talking about, who is required to test versus who can be accepted, who can be excluded from testing. The kids who cannot be excluded from testing, generally they have to take either the general assessment or this alternate assessment. So again, in some cases you get students who are on that, you're thinking to yourself, we're not going to get any useful information out of the regular assessment, but is the student really a qualifier for the alternate? And I think this is going to continue to be something that we all, have to look at and work towards. One thing for, I'm trying to think data-wise, I don't know that there's a disadvantage in the accountability system, because in fact, those 711 students who were proficient or ready will now, going forward would be counted as ready. So it's just something I wanted you to I wanted to make you aware of, that these are some of the decisions, some of the actions that the state has to include in the state plan and how they're addressing it. So let's go ahead and let's talk about mobility. Full academic year, which was first introduced in some ways under AYP, because there were concerns that schools would be held accountable for students that were not in their system for a long enough period of time where the impact could be attributed to the school. And we could argue a lot of those points around there, but basically what came out of that was every state in the nation came up with a definition for full academic year. And what you see in front of you is that policy that was under AYP and ESSA flexibility waivers. Students who were a full academic year were basically enrolled in the same school on or before October 1 through testing. In some cases, under the old system, that was less than 6 months, just because of the nature of when we did testing. These days, it tends to be around 6 to 7 months. So it's quite fascinating. Anyway, we have a school highly mobile and a district highly mobile definition. And I don't want to go into big detail because I'm assuming that most of you guys would know these definitions. But the big thing to remember is these students, if they are considered school highly mobile, then they're excluded from the school level indicator calculations. And I haven't heard yet that we're going to do anything district level. I don't see where district is addressed specifically in ESSA, so that one remains to be seen. I know we will still have to report at the district level, but now we'll have to report including highly mobile. So the questions I have for you are, in reflecting on what I could find in the statute on partial attendance, there are two places. One is that they consider a student who has not attended the same school within a local education agency for at least half of a school year. So that kind of fits with our definition. We are at about half a school year. The performances of such students in the indicators, so these are the achievement, the growth, the graduation rate, and the fifth indicator, may not be used in the system of meaningful differentiation, but for the purposes of reporting shall be included. So basically it's what I mentioned before. Those kids will be excluded from the accountability indicators, only those four. We have to include mobile students in English language because of other topics in the law. So English language the ELPA 21. They have to be included in the indicator, which is indicator number 3. Then what I really want, which I think is where we really need to be talking, is I here. In the case of a high school student who has not attended the same school within a local education agency for at least half of a school year and has exited high school without a regular high school diploma and without transferring to another high school that grants a regular high school diploma during that school year, the local educational agency has a choice in how they include the student to calculate the graduation rate. These are the 2 choices. They can assign the student to the cohort at which such student, or to the school at which such student was enrolled for the greatest proportion of school days while enrolled in grades 9 through 12, or they can attach that student to the school the student most recently enrolled in. And this is one that is a real pain when you're doing the graduation rate calculations. I was a little surprised at the number of students that are just, lost out there. And we found them because we had to work on the 5-year. So these are kids that are, so here's an example. You have a high school that closes. That student at the end of 11th grade is on time or not on time, but they never show up again at another or they show up again partway through the year at another high school. Do you assign them to the school they show up in, or do you assign them to whichever school you can determine had the greatest proportion of time? In working with FUNG, I can tell you some kids have 12, 15 different locations for their graduation trajectory, their cohort years. Some kids only have 1. It's really a mixed bag. So my question would be, what are your thoughts? I will include this as a survey question, but if there are things I need to put in the context of it, please help me to know.
Denise, this is Mel.
Yes.
Am I reading this right? Am I thinking that I could assign a child to another district? Since I see the word "or" here.
Well, so not you necessarily, but the state would have to. So when there's a group of kids that show up in the data set that they're partially attending, they just enrolled in this last school, or they show up in a school that doesn't award these diplomas. What do we do with them? So you wouldn't be able to assign them. The state would have that responsibility to calculate the greatest proportion of school days, because you're not going to know all of their history from another district to calculate those proportions.
Well, right now, I can look and I can see that they've spent the majority of 3 years in another district, and then they come to us their senior year. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, but in the end, it would be the state that would have to do the assigning for the most part. And you would probably, in the correction system, have an opportunity to review that. Sorry, Lewis, that's one more thing.
Denise, this is Ashley Daniel.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. I just wanted to throw out 3 things that I'm not sure that this is going to address that are our biggest issues. Kids who fall off track and then leave to homeschool, private school, or move out of the country.
Okay.
We see that the most in the kids that continue to remain in our denominator in our cohorts.
Mm-hmm. And I know, Lewis, you in the guidance, I believe, I know that homeschool, and I got to look at that. I know I would probably need FUNG. I need to double check with FUNG. I don't know if FUNG is listening in, but there are certain drop codes or certain codes that allow those kids to be removed. But if they fall off time, then generally they are they are left in the cohort where they were last on time. So this is one that we can look into, Ashley, and see exactly how things are behaving with these kids. That's one. What was the other? You said you had 3.
Oh, those were just the 3 situations, 3 different things that I continue to see that I have not had no luck. And sometimes those kids, especially the ones that move out of country, I've had one that was here for 1 week at the end of May, and just because of some legal processes on age placement and grade levels, that we place them in the age appropriate grade level, even though we know they're not going to progress to the next grade level. So we get caught in kind of a catch-22 there. So
I hear you. I keep thinking about how the age appropriate piece just kind of, how that in the grade level, how our system is really designed to reward us for keeping kids in these artificial grade levels, as opposed to really looking at what the student needs to successfully be prepared. Now, having an extended cohort, having the 5-year cohort is going to help us to some degree on that, but you're right that right now, the way the system is set up, we're almost punished for doing what might be best for the student. I hate to say that. So that's something to keep in mind too, because I know like in schools where you're doing some pretty innovative things and you're moving students along, not necessarily based on Carnegie units and time, how is that interacting? I know that if they're graduating early, that is should never be a penalty for the school. When the student takes a little bit longer, hopefully we can recoup them. And you can get credit for that through the 5-year cohort. So that's just something. So when you're thinking about these 2 options, when you see the survey, be thinking about this, and also be thinking about what are the concerns or questions or maybe the data procedures that you would want to know more about, given a 4-year cohort calculation and given a 5-year cohort calculation, because y'all are so knowledgeable about those data procedures, and you are the ones best to inform that information. So be thinking about the implications of either of these 2 when you answer a survey about this, because I can imagine where it could disadvantage you for 4-year, but you could recoup it on the 5th year. I'm not sure yet. I'd have to really look at the data. Other thoughts before I move to the next one? We're really hitting close to time. I do have quite a bit more. When I say quite a bit more, maybe 15 minutes more, if you're willing to hang in there. I would love for you to hang in there. Including all schools in the system, I'm not going to spend a boatload of time on this, but there are really 3 main areas that need to be addressed. One is feeder schools, new schools and reconfigured schools, and then specialty schools. And I'll give you this information for background. There's a link at the top of this slide where when you click on it, it takes you to the old ESSA Flexibility Accountability Addendum. God, that's a mouthful. That is where you see the operational decision rules, if you will, the way that the calculations were being done. For your information, we haven't come very far in grade spans. Under AYP, we had to group schools into grade spans. They were called AYP groups because you had to do targets by grade spans. Under ESSA, the issue is you have a 5th indicator for which you have to, attribute it to specific schools with specific grade spans. So what I have on the left are kind of the old decision rules for how you would put a school into a particular grade span, PK5, 6-8, and 9-12. And I'm showing you on the right the current count of schools that fit in those different grade ranges that would then be in those grade spans. And basically the way the rule worked was if you had a tested grade, if you had more tested grades in a particular span, that was the span that you were in. If you had the same number of grades across 2 grade spans, then you always went to the higher grade span. And I'm trying to remember why. I know the targets were usually lower in the higher grade spans. So it was an advantage to the schools. That's the way the rule played out. I want you to be thinking about this because we need to answer the question you're going to get in the survey. Do we use the same rules? Do we tweak it? Do we make adjustments? what would you like in this survey as options? Are there any other options, if you want to discuss them now or if you want to email me, other ways to think about how we assign to grade spans, because we do have these 51, I think, different configurations, and everybody's got to fit into a grade span for the 5th indicator. And even though we haven't talked about it much, we could think about interim measures and targets in a grade span level or individualized. So be thinking about that. I'm gonna make myself a note when you get this so that you can reflect on that. Feeder schools, we currently have 45-ish, maybe 44, it changes. We update them annually using the new active and closed lists. Periodically, the department sends out a questionnaire saying, who are your feeder schools? But we have to cover all schools. And right now, the feeder schools they get the status of the school that they're paired with, that they feed into. The question I have for you that I'll put in the survey is, do we want to continue that same practice? Some states are adding something, some kind of indicator as a 5th indicator into the K-5 grade span from their PK2 level. So some are, and it's interesting, like they might be looking at readiness leaving kindergarten. They might be looking at reading levels leaving 2nd grade. Not many states do what we do, which is assess the earlier grades, but they are looking at what data they can collect, or they're looking at kind of building towards being able to do these things. Thinking about how we're going to be changing PK2 assessments coming up. What would you like to see? How could we transition from current feeder schools getting exactly what the paired school gets to maybe having feeder schools have some information? Or do you not want that at all? So that's something to keep in mind. I'm not going to give you much wait time, but any quick thoughts? All right. New schools and reconfigured schools. That link I gave you goes into great detail, gives you this basic information. There were a lot of different ways that a school could be considered new or reconfigured. And I want to say that this is probably the biggest nightmare when you're looking at annual determinations. 2 existing schools close and combine to form a new school. A school increases its number of students by 50% compared to the prior year. They increase a tested grade. They open an open enrollment charter. That's their initial year of existence. These are schools that we have to come up with a way to include in the annual system of meaningful differentiation. And this slide, which I don't expect you to read through, is what the state was doing before. But what you're going to notice about this is this was all AMO based. This was all about their targets. I need not just I, but we all need your help in thinking about how do we incorporate new schools. So say we're doing an index and we're putting a bunch of different measures together. Maybe that school has only 1 year of data. Are there things that we need to do? If we're not worried about a target for the index, then we could use a single year. What if the index includes multiple years? How do we deal with stability in that single year? On the side of reporting and using targets, maybe for graduation rate, the top choice that came out was giving schools credit for approaching, meeting, or exceeding their target. Well, what target would we use if they're a brand new school or they're a reconfigured school? These are the things that we're going to be asking you about in the survey, but I want you to have the source of the information. And then these implications, I'm basically just saying the same thing. How would we address new schools in the index multiple measures or index matrix system? How would you set interim progress measures? Given that they may not have a history. So how do you set them for that first year? Open enrollment charter schools used to get the state target. New schools within a district would get the district target. Be thinking about this because this is part of what we need feedback on. And then exit criteria. Woof. Are y'all still with me? I don't know how many of you are still on, but before we can seriously discuss exit criteria, we have to have a sense of identification of schools. And this means we have to understand that meaningful differentiation and identification of schools a little bit better. there are 2 required identifications. We have to identify comprehensive support and improvement schools. And notice nowhere in here does it say shaming and labeling. So Danielle, I am so sensitive to what you've been talking about in terms of that issue of the negative side of the determination. And then there's targeted support and improvement. And you may not have known this, but there are actually 3 different kinds of targeted support schools. Low performing subgroup, that's identified every 3 years. Chronically underperforming, which can't happen until they've gone through 3 years of being targeted and don't improve. And then the final one is consistently underperforming. And in this case, these schools are annually identified, and the state is required to provide notification to the district, to the superintendent, that schools in their district have consistently underperforming subgroups. So CSI seems easy compared to TSI. And then we look at the details. So all those identifications have to occur using this system of meaningful differentiation, and they have to be based on all indicators in the state's accountability system. So that means the achievement, the growth, the graduation rate, the English language proficiency, progress, where it meets minimum N, and the 5th indicator. So you put all of that together, and with all of that information together, and there's all this weighting that has to happen, and you have to have substantial weight to the indicators, the first 4 indicators, and less weight to the 5th indicator. And in that, we have to also think about any subgroup of students that is consistently underperforming. So I'm telling you, complexity is there whether we want it or not. And then the law gets into identifying the comprehensive support and improvement schools, the CSI schools. And these are the lowest performing 5% of all schools. And in addition, if you have a school, a public high school, that is failing to graduate a third or more of its students, so they're not meeting 66.7% graduation rate, they have to be automatically a CSI school. And then this public schools in the state considered under subsection, that's code for chronically underperforming subgroup. We should not see any of those until we've had at least 3 years under the new system. And then the state can also come up with additional categories. So if you wanted to use additional categories and establish school ratings that had the highest to this lowest level, the state can choose to do that. So that 5% to me is kind of interesting. This is just a slide that basically reiterates what I just said. It's going to be out there for your reference for the survey. I'll probably try to put this information in there too. But given schools get in by being in lowest 5%, how do schools get out? I put this in here because I have heard so many people say, and sometimes I just want to say it's more complicated than that, you should get out the way that you get in. But if you get out the way that you get in, then it's really just about your ranking. So when you get the survey, when the survey is finally available, please be thinking about this. How should schools get out? We don't want them to try and have to meet unrealistic interim progress. So maybe that's something we can think about, but what would that progress look like? Would it be progress towards what an average school looks like on the annual rating? Would it be progress towards a specific point on the annual school rating? Other ideas, please email me any other ideas for how schools could exit, because you're always going to have a bottom 5%. And it's, as one retired superintendent once said, it's not that I have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun everybody else who's running away from the bear. So I don't know if that's the best way to give schools to incentivize movement out of the CSI. And then what I put under here is a little bit more information about targeted support and intervention. And I'm still working on this because they do give you 3 different ways of thinking about it. So I'm going to continue to build the TSI part out for you. But if you get ideas, if you have thoughts as you read through it, please email me. I know we're way over time. But these are the low performing subgroup. This is the one that's going to come once every 3 years. And something you really need to pay attention to on this slide is how these are identified. This is the statute. Any school in which one or more subgroups of students is performing at or below the performance of all students in the lowest performing schools. That's the 5%. And when they say lowest performance, they mean on all 5 indicators. Those are the schools that have to be that, they're the ones who have to be the TSI schools. So be thinking about that. Think about that relative to your own data. And then consistently underperforming. This is the one that would be identified annually. It doesn't look like this one really plays into any sanctions or any support in any way. It just is a notification piece and has to be reported. And then finally, I think really the way we should think about this is we do have achievement gaps, and our achievement gaps are the hugest when you look at 3 groups: our African American students, our English learners, and our special ed students. And we need to be thinking about what gaps are unacceptable. What's a gap that's unacceptable? And gaps among which groups should we really be focusing on? I think we're going to have to do all groups, but if we think about the groups for which we need to really focus, some of those lowest performing groups, then that can help us situate planning from here on in. So I think, y'all are awesome hanging in there. Next steps. You can see there's a tremendous amount of information. I don't think we're going to get to all of it in the next meeting. So I will be emailing you with a little doodle poll to see if you could meet for maybe 1 or 2 more. I am a glutton for punishment, I guess. But I really feel like it's important for us to talk through this and for you all to inform this process as much as possible. So last thoughts, questions before we are done for the day. If that is it, then, oh my goodness, thank you all for hanging with me. Somebody asked the question, is the non-regulatory guidance on graduation rate from 2008 still going to apply? That is one of those questions that's still in the to be determined. One of those things that we're not sure about, but we're trying to get answers to because it does impact us. And thank you all so much. I really appreciate all of you, and look for additional messages from me, and talk to you next week at the earliest. Thank you.